After the Sophia stage, transformation rarely appears in a dramatic way. There is no sudden revelation, no moment when everything changes all at once. From the outside, life may look almost exactly the same. The same routines continue. The same conversations happen. The same people remain around you. But something inside the psyche begins to reorganize. And the strange thing about this transformation is that it often begins with movements so small they are almost impossible to notice. A reaction that slows down. A silence where there once would have been an explanation. A subtle shift in how you perceive people during a conversation. At first, these changes feel insignificant, too small to be called transformation. But complex systems rarely change through dramatic events. Sometimes the smallest movement inside a system can slowly alter everything that follows. In chaos theory, this idea became known as the butterfly effect. The image is simple. A butterfly moves its wings in one place, and that tiny disturbance begins to travel through the system. Small air currents shift. Patterns begin to adjust. And eventually the entire atmosphere reorganizes in ways that would have been impossible to predict from that first movement. Something surprisingly similar can happen inside the psyche. A small pause before reacting. A moment of awareness during a conversation. A quiet decision not to enter an emotional dynamic that once felt automatic. None of these moments seem significant on their own. But when they begin to accumulate, they slowly change the way psychological energy moves through your life. At first, the change is almost invisible. But gradually, certain reactions disappear. Certain patterns become easier to recognize. Situations that once pulled you into emotional tension begin to lose their gravity. And without realizing it at first, the way you move through the world begins to change. Not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through small psychological shifts that begin to ripple outward. Like the movement of a butterfly's wings inside the psyche. Small movements that slowly begin to change everything. Imagine a familiar situation. You are in the middle of a conversation, perhaps at work, perhaps with a family member. Someone says something that carries a tone you recognize immediately. Not openly aggressive, but slightly dismissive. Something in the remark suggests criticism. For years, moments like this tended to unfold in a predictable way. Your mind would react quickly. A response would begin forming almost immediately. Part of you would start explaining your position. Another part might begin preparing a defense. Sometimes irritation would appear before you even realized it. And within seconds, the emotional tone of the conversation could shift. What started as a simple exchange suddenly carried tension. This kind of reaction often feels natural, but psychology suggests that these responses are rarely spontaneous. Carl Jung believed many of our automatic reactions are shaped by what he called complexes. A complex forms when past emotional experiences begin to connect and organize themselves into a pattern. Over time, the mind learns to recognize certain signals. A tone of voice, a type of criticism, a familiar tension in a conversation. And when those signals appear, the response can happen almost instantly. Not because the situation is new, but because the mind has already lived through something similar before. But as awareness grows, something begins to change. The same situation appears, the same type of comment, the same familiar tone. And yet this time, the reaction slows down. Not because you are forcing yourself to stay calm. Not because you are trying to control the conversation, but because you notice something. You notice the irritation beginning to rise. You notice the impulse to explain. You notice the familiar emotional response starting to form. And in that moment, something new becomes possible. Instead of reacting immediately, you observe the reaction itself. The comment is still there. The dynamic is still there. But now there is space between what happens and how you respond. Sometimes that space lasts only a second. But even a second can change the entire situation, because the reaction is no longer operating completely outside awareness. Once a response becomes visible, it begins to lose some of its automatic power. You may still speak. You may still respond. But the response is no longer purely mechanical. It is chosen. And that small change begins to influence everything that follows. Conversations unfold differently. Certain tensions dissolve before they escalate. And interactions that once moved quickly into conflict begin to slow down. At first, the difference may seem small. Just a moment of awareness where there once would have been reaction. But moments like these accumulate. And over time, those pauses begin to alter the emotional rhythm of how you move through conversations. At some point, another change begins to appear in the way you move through conversations. You may notice it during an ordinary interaction. Someone questions a decision you made. A colleague asks why you chose a certain approach. A friend seems slightly confused by something you said. In the past, moments like these often triggered a familiar response. You would begin clarifying, adding context, offering extra details so the other person could fully understand what you meant. Sometimes the explanation would grow longer than the situation required. You might describe the circumstances, explain what led to the decision, add more information to prevent possible misunderstandings. For many people, this habit develops gradually over time. Part of it comes from empathy. Part of it comes from a desire to maintain harmony in relationships. And part of it comes from a deeper wish to be understood correctly. Over time, the mind begins to anticipate confusion before it even appears. So clarification becomes a reflex. Before anyone even asks for it, the mind is already preparing a longer answer. But as awareness grows, something begins to shift in these moments. The impulse to justify every decision slowly begins to fade. The same situation appears. Someone questions your choice. Someone seems unsure about your reasoning. But this time, the response is much simpler. You answer the question, and then you stop. The additional layers of explanation never appear. At first, this can feel unusual. Part of the mind still expects the discussion to continue. It almost anticipates the next round of clarification. But something surprising happens. The conversation simply moves forward. The situation resolves itself, or the topic changes naturally, and the elaborate explanation that once felt necessary turns out to be optional. This shift often reflects a deeper psychological change. As awareness grows, the psyche becomes less dependent on constant external confirmation. Instead of needing every intention to be fully understood by everyone around you, a different kind of stability begins to appear. You know why you made the decision. You know what guided that choice. And that internal clarity becomes enough. Communication becomes simpler. Sometimes a single sentence replaces what once would have been a long explanation. I thought this would work better. That's the direction I decided to take. Or sometimes the answer is even shorter. Yes. No. That won't work for me. Interestingly, these shorter responses often change the tone of the interaction. When explanations become simpler, the emotional energy of the conversation shifts. There is less negotiation, less tension, and fewer opportunities for misunderstandings to expand into larger discussions. What once required long conversations now resolves in a few words. Not because you have become indifferent, and not because you care less about others, but because the inner center guiding your decisions has become clearer. And when that inner clarity is present, communication no longer needs so many layers. A few words become enough. After some time, another change begins to appear. Not so much in how you respond to situations, but in how quickly you understand them. Interactions that once felt confusing begin to make sense much sooner. Certain exchanges that previously required hours of reflection now become clear while they are still unfolding. In the past, you might leave a conversation with a strange feeling that something was slightly off. Nothing openly hostile had happened. No obvious conflict had taken place. And yet, something in the exchange felt uncomfortable. Perhaps someone offered a compliment that carried a faint trace of criticism. Perhaps a discussion slowly became tense without any clear reason. Or perhaps you walked away feeling strangely drained, without being able to explain why. Moments like these often required time to process. Later in the day, you might replay the interaction in your mind. You would revisit certain phrases, certain tones of voice, trying to understand where the tension had begun. But as awareness grows, the mind begins to recognize these dynamics much faster. Instead of understanding the situation hours later, you begin to see what is happening while the interaction is still unfolding. Someone makes a remark that sounds supportive on the surface, but subtly redirects responsibility toward you. Another person tells a story in which every difficulty somehow ends up being caused by someone else. A discussion slowly shifts in a direction that places you in the role of defending yourself. And suddenly the structure of the situation becomes visible. You are no longer only hearing the words. You begin to notice the emotional current behind them. This shift does not necessarily make you more suspicious of people. In many cases, it simply makes interactions easier to understand. You begin to recognize common psychological dynamics more quickly. Defensiveness, projection, subtle attempts to steer the direction of a conversation. Moments when someone quietly shifts responsibility away from themselves. Or moments when insecurity hides beneath confidence. As awareness expands, perception becomes more precise. You begin to notice signals that once passed unnoticed. A slight inconsistency between someone's words and their tone. A familiar tension appearing in different situations. A certain dynamic returning again and again. And once these signals become visible, something important happens. You no longer participate in them automatically. Sometimes you redirect the conversation. Sometimes you choose not to engage with the dynamic at all. And sometimes you simply observe it without reacting. But the interaction has already changed. Because once the underlying dynamic becomes visible, it loses much of its ability to operate unnoticed. What once required hours of reflection now appears in real time. And that clarity begins to influence every interaction that follows. There was a time when certain moments could stay in your mind for hours, sometimes even for days. A single remark, a short exchange of messages, an interaction that seemed ordinary at first, but later began returning to your thoughts. You might find yourself revisiting it again and again, trying to understand what the other person meant. Wondering whether you should have responded differently, reconstructing the tone of voice, the expression, the exact words that were used. For many people, this mental replay becomes a familiar part of daily life. Certain interactions seem to carry a kind of emotional gravity. Even after they end, the mind continues orbiting around them. But as awareness grows, something begins to change. The same kinds of moments still occur. A remark that carries a hint of criticism, a disagreement during a meeting, a message that feels slightly tense. Yet the emotional pull of these experiences begins to weaken. The mind notices what is happening, understands the dynamic, and then moves on much more easily. Instead of replaying the interaction repeatedly, the moment simply passes. Instead of trying to decode every word, the mind releases the situation. This change often surprises people. At first, it can feel as if you have become less sensitive. But in reality, something very different has happened. Sensitivity has not disappeared. Awareness has increased. You still notice the tone. You still perceive the emotional atmosphere of the exchange. But you no longer become fully absorbed by it. Psychologically, This often happens when old emotional associations begin losing their influence over how we interpret events. In the past, certain remarks might have activated deeper layers inside the mind. Old memories, old insecurities, old expectations, and those associations could intensify the emotional weight of the moment. But as those internal triggers lose their grip, the same interactions no longer create the same chain reaction. A remark remains just a remark. A disagreement remains just a disagreement. It no longer expands into something larger inside the mind. This gradually changes the emotional tone of everyday interactions. Situations that once escalated quickly now remain calm. Moments that once produced long internal debates now dissolve naturally. And exchanges that once might have led to tension pass without leaving much residue behind. Often the people around you may not notice the change directly, but they may feel its effect. Because when emotional gravity weakens, the dynamics of interaction begin to shift. Conflicts lose some of the energy that once sustained them. Arguments struggle to gain momentum. And emotional currents that once pulled you into tension simply move past you. What once felt heavy now moves lightly through your experience, not because the world has changed, but because the inner reactions that once amplified those moments are no longer operating in the same way. After some time, another consequence begins to appear. Not inside you this time, but around you. The way people interact with you begins to change. At first, the difference is small. A conversation that once lasted an hour now ends much sooner. A discussion that once might have turned into an argument never quite reaches that point. Certain tensions that used to appear regularly simply stop showing up. In the past, many connections were guided by familiar emotional rhythms. Two people might bond over shared frustrations, over similar reactions to situations, over the same interpretations of other people's behavior. Sometimes these shared tendencies quietly become the foundation of the connection itself. But when one person begins to change internally, that rhythm often begins to shift. At first, the difference appears in simple moments. Someone starts telling a story about a conflict they had earlier in the day. Before, you might have immediately joined the emotional current of the story. You would analyze the situation together, reinforce each other's perspective, add your own reactions. But now something feels different. You still listen. You still care. But the emotional pull is not the same. Instead of being drawn into the frustration, you notice yourself observing the situation more calmly. The exchange continues, but the old flow of the conversation feels slightly altered. Sometimes the shift appears in another way. A topic that once kept conversations going for hours now feels strangely repetitive. The same frustrations return. The same complaints appear in slightly different forms. The same tensions surface again and again. And gradually, a quiet realization emerges. Some connections were sustained by a certain emotional chemistry that is no longer present in the same way. When that chemistry changes, the interaction naturally begins to shift as well. Sometimes this happens smoothly. Both people adjust. The connection evolves. The conversations become calmer and more balanced. But other times the change is less symmetrical. One person continues moving within the familiar emotional currents, while the other has already begun stepping outside of them. In those situations, distance can begin to appear, not through conflict, not through dramatic decisions, but through small adjustments. Conversations become shorter. Certain invitations are declined. Meetings happen less often. And gradually, without a clear moment of separation, the connection moves into a different place. This process can sometimes feel bittersweet, because the bond itself was real. The shared history was real. But the emotional rhythm that once sustained the connection has changed. And as that rhythm changes, the social landscape around you begins to reorganize. Interestingly, This shift often affects new interactions as well. People may respond to you differently. Certain dynamics that once relied on predictable reactions no longer find the same entry point. Attempts to draw you into tension lose their momentum. Old habits of interaction struggle to return. And slowly, the relational space around you begins to adjust. Not through force, not through confrontation, but simply because the inner center guiding your responses is no longer the same. When these changes begin to accumulate, something deeper starts to take shape. At first, each shift may seem unrelated. A pause in a conversation, a shorter explanation, a clearer perception of certain dynamics. Moments that once carried emotional tension losing their intensity. Connections around you slowly beginning to change. Individually, each of these experiences may feel small, even ordinary. But over time, they begin to reveal something important. They are not separate changes. They are different expressions of the same transformation. Something inside the psyche has begun to reorganize. In the past, much of your attention may have been guided by external dynamics. Other people's reactions, other people's expectations, other people's emotional states. Interactions could easily pull your attention outward. You would feel the tension of the moment, the pressure of the conversation, the emotional tone of the room, and your responses would often adjust themselves around those signals. But as awareness deepens, the center guiding your responses slowly begins to move. Instead of constantly adjusting to the emotional field around you, your responses begin to arise from a more stable internal reference. You still perceive what is happening around you. You still understand the emotional atmosphere of a situation. But your reactions are no longer shaped entirely by those external forces. Something inside the psyche has become more grounded. Decisions begin to feel clearer. Silence becomes easier. Certain tensions lose their ability to pull you into them. You begin to notice something else as well. Situations that once felt complicated now appear much simpler. Many interactions that once seemed emotionally complex reveal themselves to be quite predictable. And this clarity gradually changes the way you move through daily life. You begin choosing where to place your attention, where to invest your energy, which dynamics are worth entering, and which ones can simply pass by. From the outside, this transformation may not look dramatic. The same routines may continue. The same environments may remain. But internally, something fundamental has shifted. The psychological center from which your responses emerge is no longer the same. And when that center changes, everything around it slowly begins to reorganize. When people imagine transformation, they often picture something dramatic. A sudden realization. A powerful moment that changes everything at once. But psychological change rarely happens that way. More often, it begins with movements so small that they are easy to overlook. A pause where there once would have been an immediate reaction. A conversation where fewer words are needed. A growing clarity about the emotional dynamics unfolding around you. Situations that once carried tension losing their ability to pull you in. And relationships gradually reorganizing themselves as your inner responses change. Each of these shifts may seem minor on its own, almost too small to be considered a transformation. But taken together, they begin to alter the entire flow of how you move through the world. In chaos theory, the butterfly effect describes how a tiny movement in one part of a system can eventually reshape the entire structure of that system. Something similar can happen within the psyche. A single moment of awareness, a pause before reacting, a decision not to enter a familiar emotional dynamic. And slowly, those moments begin to accumulate. They influence conversations. They change how tensions unfold. They reshape the way relationships develop around you. From the outside, the change may appear almost invisible. But internally, the direction of your life has begun to shift. Not through force, not through dramatic reinvention, but through a quiet reorganization of the center from which your responses emerge. And interestingly, many people notice that this process often begins at a very specific psychological turning point, the moment when the need for approval quietly starts to disappear. If you want to understand that moment more deeply, you may want to watch the next video, The Strange Moment Approval Dies, the Sophia Stage. Because in many ways, that moment is where this entire transformation truly begins. Like the movement of a butterfly's wings inside the psyche. Small shifts that slowly begin to change everything.